Welcome to the Cat Pump's plunger pump servicing video. In this video, we will be demonstrating the proper steps in servicing the fluid end of the pump, including the valves, seals, and the plungers for the 3 through 68 frame plunger pumps, as well as the 2SF and 4SF plunger pumps. This video is divided into several sections. Each section covers a pump frame size or group of frame sizes constructed with similar characteristics. You may advance to any section at any time. At the beginning of each section is a listing of service kits and helpful common tools for each model. These tools are recommended to avoid damage to pump parts and minimize the time required for servicing. During this video, we will be servicing only one valve, one seal, and one plunger. The same procedure should be followed for the remaining valves, seals, and plungers on each pump. In the first section, we will service the 5-frame, 7-frame, and 15-frame pumps. The valve assembly in these pumps can be serviced without removing the manifold head. 2 valve kits are needed for a complete inlet and discharge valve servicing. Remove the valve plugs using a 24mm hex tool on the 5-frame or a 27mm hex tool on the 7 and 15-frame pumps. Then unthread the valve plug by hand and remove from the valve chamber. Examine the O-ring on the valve plug for any cuts or wear and replace. To remove the old O-ring, insert a small flathead screwdriver under the O-ring and roll it over the threaded end of the valve plug. Then lubricate the new O-ring to assist in slipping it over the threaded end of the valve plug. Note: the 5-frame model 45 and the 7-frame models 56, 57, 59, 60, and 70 have an extended valve plug with an O-ring and backup ring at the base of the valve plug. Install the backup ring first, then the O-ring. Also, the Model 70 has a special spiral backup ring on both the valve seat and the valve plug. Using pliers, remove the valve assembly from the manifold head by grasping the tab on the top of the spring retainer. Usually, the valve assembly will remain together while being removed. To separate the valve assembly, insert a screwdriver into the side of the retainer and press on the back side of the valve to begin separation. Then between the retainer and the valve seat to separate completely. The valve assembly consists of the valve seat, valve, spring, and spring retainer. If the valve assembly separates during removal, remove the spring and valve with a needle nose pliers. Then, with reverse pliers, remove the valve seat from the manifold chamber. Examine the O-ring and backup ring for cuts or wear and replace. Then examine the seat for wear, scale buildup, or pitting and replace. Note: the models 45, 42HS, and 43HS have only an O-ring on the valve seat. Examine the valve for scale buildup, grooves, pitting, or wear, and replace. Examine the spring for breaks, fatigue, or scale buildup, and replace as needed. Examine the spring retainer for breaks or scale buildup and replace as needed. When servicing from a kit, the valve components will come pre-assembled. Before placing the valve assembly into the valve chamber, apply liquid gasket into the O-ring crevice. Now grasp the valve assembly by the top tab with the pliers and press into the manifold chamber until completely seated. If using individual parts for servicing, place the new backup ring, then the O-ring onto the valve seat. Then place the valve seat on the work surface with the O-ring side down. Place the valve onto the seat with the concave side up. Lay the spring onto the recessed back side of the valve. Then place the spring retainer over the assembly and tap with a soft mallet until the assembly snaps together. Apply Loctite 242 to the threads of the valve plug and thread into the manifold chamber. Torque to 870 inch-pounds or 520 inch-pounds for the models 43HS and 45. To service the seals, the manifold head must be removed. Only one seal kit is needed for a complete servicing. Using an 8mm Allen wrench on the 5-frame pumps, a 14mm hex tool on the 7-frame pumps, or a 17mm hex tool on the 15-frame pumps, remove the socket head screws or flanged nuts. Rotate the crankshaft by hand to start the separation of the manifold head from the crankcase. To further separate the manifold head from the crankcase, insert 2 flat head screwdrivers on opposite sides behind the manifold and carefully pry away from the crankcase. Now remove the manifold head by supporting it from the underside to avoid damaging the plungers and place it crankcase side up. Using a reverse pliers, remove the low-pressure seal from the seal case. Then use a seal case removal tool to completely unthread the seal case from the manifold chamber. Remove the O-ring from the seal case. Then, with the reverse pliers, remove from the manifold chamber the high-pressure seal on standard plunger models or the female adapter V-packings and male adapter on the high-pressure V-packing models. On the standard plunger pump, examine the high-pressure seal for frayed edges or normal wear and replace. Apply liquid gasket to the outer surface of the high-pressure seal. Then press it into the manifold chamber until completely seated with the metal backside up. On the high-pressure V-packing models, examine the male adapter for wear or scale buildup and replace if needed. Insert the male adapter into the manifold chamber with the V side up. Examine the V-packings for wear or damage and replace. Apply liquid gasket to the outside of the V-packings and insert them into the chamber with the V side down. Note, the Model 70 has 3 V-packings. Examine the female adapter for scale buildup or wear and replace as needed. Insert the female adapter into the manifold chamber with the V side down. Examine the seal case for a clean seating surface. If there is scale buildup or wear, replace the seal case. Examine the O-ring on the seal case for any cuts or wear and replace. Install the new O-ring into the groove on the seal case. Apply liquid gasket into the O-ring crevice and thread the seal case into the manifold. Tighten securely with the seal case removal tool. Examine the low-pressure seal for distortion or wear and spring fatigue and replace with a new low-pressure seal. The inside of the new seal is already pre-greased. Apply liquid gasket to the outer surface and insert the new seal into the seal case with the garter spring down. The ceramic plungers and plunger retainers should be serviced on the same schedule as the seals. To service the plungers, first remove the oil pan, then the seal retainers with wicks. The seal retainer is a two-piece item that can be easily separated. Use a 12mm hex tool on all 5, 7, and 15 frame pumps, or an 11mm hex tool on the OEM 5, 7, and 15 frame pumps. Loosen the plunger retainer about 3 to 4 turns. Push the plunger back to separate it from the retainer and finish on threading the plunger retainer by hand. Remove the ceramic plunger, keyhole washer, and barrier slinger from the plunger rod. With these plunger items removed, examine the crankcase oil seal for wear or deterioration and replace as needed. Examine the barrier slinger for any scale buildup or damage and replace if needed. Place the barrier slinger onto the plunger rod with the concave side facing away from the crankcase. Place the keyhole washer on the plunger rod with the slot down. Then examine the ceramic plunger for cracks, chips, or scale buildup and replace if needed. The plunger can only be placed on the plunger rod one way, with the counter bore to the back. Do not force into place. Now examine the plunger retainer gasket, O-ring, and backup ring for any cuts or wear and replace. Install the gasket first, then the O-ring and backup ring. Lubricate the plunger retainer O-ring to avoid cutting during installation. Apply Loctite 242 to the threads of the plunger retainer and thread on hand tight. Then torque to 55 inch-pounds. Now insert the new wick with the long tab through the small hole in the seal retainer. Snap the two pieces of the retainer together and slide over the plunger with the long tab down and the holes to the top and bottom. Then replace the oil pan. Hold the seal retainers in place and rotate the crankshaft to line up the outside two plungers. Lightly lubricate the plungers and carefully slide the manifold head onto the plungers, supporting from the underside to avoid damaging the plungers. On the high-pressure V-packing models or larger manifolds, it may be necessary to gently tap with a soft mallet until the manifold is flush with the crankcase. Replace the washers and socket head screws or the flanged nuts and torque to 220 inch-pounds on all 5, 7, and 15 frame pumps. In Section 2, we will be servicing the split manifold pumps. A similar procedure is followed for both the 25 frame and 3 frame pumps. To service the valves, the discharge manifold must be removed. Using a 10mm Allen wrench for the 25 frame or an 8mm Allen wrench for the 3 frame, remove the socket head screws. 1 valve kit is needed for the 3 frame pumps and 2 are needed for the 25 frame pumps. Support the underside of the discharge manifold and lightly tap the top back of the manifold with a soft mallet. 2 screwdrivers may be needed to further separate the discharge manifold from the inlet manifold. Remove the discharge manifold and place it crankcase side up. The discharge valve assembly is secured in the upper chambers by the discharge valve spacer, while the inlet valve assembly is secured in the lower chambers by the inlet valve adapter. The discharge valve spacers can remain in either the inlet manifold or the discharge manifold. To remove the spacer from the manifold, insert 2 screwdrivers on opposite sides under the machined lip on the outside of the spacer and pry out. To remove the inlet valve adapter, use the reverse pliers to pull out of the manifold. With a flathead screwdriver, carefully pry the valve seat O-ring, valve, spring, and spring retainer from the manifold chamber. Exercise caution to avoid scoring the manifold chamber wall. Inspect the spring retainer for any scale buildup or wear and place the new spring retainer into the valve chamber. Then examine the spring for fatigue or breaks and place the new spring into the retainer. Examine the valve for pitting or grooves and set the new valve onto the spring with the concave side down. Inspect the valve seat O-ring for any cuts or wear and replace. Apply liquid gasket to the O-ring and place it on the lip of the spring retainer. Examine the valve seat for any grooves, pitting or wear and replace. Place the new valve seat onto the O-ring with the concave side down. Look for wear or damage to both the inner and outer rings on the inlet adapter and replace. On the 25 frame, fit the O-rings into both the outer groove and face groove of the inlet adapter and apply liquid gasket into the O-ring crevice. On the 3 frame, apply liquid gasket to the 1 O-ring and place into the manifold chamber. Then fit the other O-ring into the face groove of the inlet adapter and apply liquid gasket to the O-ring crevice. Then press the inlet adapter into the lower manifold chamber. Remove and examine both O-rings on the discharge valve spacer for wear or cuts and replace as needed. Fit the new O-rings into the groove of the outside of the discharge valve spacer. Apply liquid gasket into the O-ring crevice and carefully press the spacer completely into the discharge manifold chamber with the smaller diameter side down. To service the seals, the inlet manifold must be removed. Use a 10 mm Allen wrench on the 25 frame pumps or an 8 mm Allen wrench on the 3 frame pumps. Only one seal kit is needed for a complete servicing. Support the inlet manifold and lightly tap the top back with a soft mallet. Remove the inlet manifold and place it crankcase side down. Use a reverse pliers to remove the high-pressure seal. Now invert the inlet manifold with the crankcase side up. The low-pressure seal may stay on the plunger or in the inlet manifold. Remove the low-pressure seal using reverse pliers or slide it off the plunger by hand. Examine the low-pressure seal for wear or spring fatigue and replace. Apply liquid gasket to the outside of the new low-pressure seal and carefully press it into the inlet manifold chamber with the spring down. Invert the inlet manifold and place the crankcase side down. Examine the high-pressure seal for deformity or wear and replace. Apply liquid gasket to the outside of the new high-pressure seal and carefully press it into the inlet manifold chamber with the metal side down. The ceramic plungers and plunger retainers should be examined on the same schedule as servicing the seals. To service the ceramic plungers, first remove the seal retainers. Loosen the plunger retainer about 3 or 4 turns using a 14 millimeter hex tool on the 25 frame pumps and an 11 millimeter hex tool on the 3 frame pumps. Grasp the ceramic plunger and push toward the crankcase until it separates from the plunger retainer. Then unthread the plunger retainer with gasket, O-ring, backup ring, and ceramic plunger. Next, remove the keyhole washer and barrier slinger from the plunger rod. With these plunger items removed, examine the crankcase oil seal for wear or deterioration and replace as needed. Examine the barrier slinger for any wear or damage and replace on the plunger rod with the concave side facing out. Then examine the keyhole washer and place on the plunger rod with the slot down. Examine the O-ring and backup ring on the plunger retainer and replace if worn or damaged. First install the gasket, then the O-ring and backup ring. Lubricate the plunger retainer O-ring to avoid cutting during installation. If the plunger retainer unthreads from the stud during removal, thread the stud into the retainer now. Examine the ceramic plunger for scoring, cracks, or scale, and replace if needed. The ceramic plunger can be cleaned with a Scotch-Brite pad. Slide the ceramic plunger onto the retainer and stud assembly with the shallower counterbore away from the retainer. The plunger can only be installed one direction, shallow counterbore towards the crankcase. Do not force into position. Apply Loctite 242 to the threads of the plunger retainer stud and thread onto the plunger rod. Then torque to 90 inch-pounds for the 25 frame pumps or 55 inch-pounds for the 3 frame pumps. Reinstall the seal retainers with the slots to the top and bottom. Rotate the crankshaft to line up the outside plungers. Then lightly lubricate the plungers with oil. Carefully slide the inlet manifold over the ceramic plungers and press until flush with the crankcase. Now reinstall the inlet socket head screws and torque to 350 inch-pounds for the 25 frame pumps and 220 inch-pounds for the 3 frame pumps. The high-pressure seals may shift while installing the inlet manifold. Use one of the discharge valve spacers to press the seals back into position. Then carefully press the discharge manifold into the inlet manifold. Use a soft mallet to tap into place and reinstall the socket head screws. Torque to 350 inch-pounds for the 25 frame pumps and 220 inch-pounds for the 3 frame pumps. Follow the torque sequence to assure the proper alignment. In Section 3, we will be servicing the 3535 and 3520 35-frame plunger pumps. These are sometimes referred to as the low-pressure models. The same servicing procedure applies to the brass, nickel, aluminum, bronze, stainless steel, or block-style versions. To service the valve assemblies, the valve plugs must be removed. Use a 41 millimeter hex tool to loosen the plug, then unthread the plug by hand from the manifold chamber. 2 valve kits are necessary to do a complete inlet and discharge valve servicing. Both may not need servicing on the same schedule. Remove the exposed coil spring from the top of the spring retainer. To remove the valve assembly, thread an 8 millimeter bolt into the top of the spring retainer, grasp the top of the bolt with the pliers, and pry the valve assembly from the manifold chamber. The flat washer will rest on top of the spring retainer. Slide it over the end of the bolt and set aside. Normally, the valve assembly will remain together. Continue to thread the 8 millimeter bolt into the top of the spring retainer until the spring retainer and valve seat separate. If the valve assembly separates during removal, lift the spring and valve from the manifold chamber by hand. Then use a reverse pliers to remove the valve seat. The valve assembly consists of the valve seat with the O-ring and backup ring, the valve, spring, and spring retainer. Remove the bolt from the spring retainer before you examine the individual parts. Remove the O-ring and backup ring on the valve seat. Inspect the seating surface of the valve seat for pitting, grooves, or wear, and replace as needed. Examine the O-ring and backup ring for cuts or wear and replace. Then install the new O-ring and backup ring onto the seat. Examine the surface of the valve for pitting, grooves, or wear and replace if needed. Place the valve onto the seat with the raised flat side up. Next, inspect the spring for fatigue or breaks and replace as needed. Place the spring over the raised flat side of the valve. Then examine the spring retainer for scale buildup or wear and replace as needed. Press the spring retainer over the valve until the assembly snaps securely together. If servicing from a kit, the new valve assembly will come pre-assembled. Rethread the bolt into the top of the spring retainer. Apply liquid gasket to the O-ring crevice on the valve seat and press the valve assembly into the manifold chamber until completely seated. Remove the bolt from the spring retainer. Place the washer over the top of the spring retainer and then the coil spring on top of the washer. Examine the O-ring and backup ring on the valve plug for cuts or wear and replace. The backup ring must go on first, then the O-ring. Then apply liquid gasket to the O-ring crevice. Apply Loctite 242 to the threads of the valve plug. Then thread into the manifold chamber and torque to 1,305 inch-pounds. To service the seals, both the discharge and inlet manifolds must be removed. Only one seal kit is needed for servicing the seals. Use a 10mm Allen wrench to remove the socket head screws from the discharge manifold. Tap the discharge manifold from the top back with a soft mallet. Support the underside of the manifold as it is being removed from the pump and place it crankcase side up. Remove the O-rings from the lower chambers of the inlet manifold. Then use a 12mm Allen wrench to remove the socket head screws from the inlet manifold. Rotate the crankshaft to begin the separation of the inlet manifold from the crankcase. Tap the rear of the inlet manifold with a soft mallet. Two screwdrivers inserted on opposite sides between the manifold and the crankcase may be needed to assist in separation. Support the inlet manifold from the underside and gradually work from the pump. Place the crankcase side of the inlet manifold down. On the 3535, 3537, and 3531 pumps, the packings are housed directly in the inlet manifold chamber and held in position with the V-packing spacer. The V-packing spacer may remain with either the inlet or discharge manifold and usually may be removed by hand. If the V-packing spacer cannot be easily removed by hand, remove the exposed O-ring and backup ring. Then insert two screwdrivers into the exposed groove on opposite sides of the spacer and pry from either manifold chamber. Exercise extreme caution to avoid scoring the O-ring groove with the screwdrivers. Next, remove the spacer with coil springs from the manifold chamber. With reverse pliers or by hand, remove the male adapter, V-packings, and female adapter from the manifold chamber. Using the reverse pliers may damage the V-packings. To service the low-pressure seal, place the inlet manifold on blocks. keeping the crankcase side down. The low-pressure seal and washer are housed in the inlet manifold chamber. Using a screwdriver, tap on alternating sides of the washer to drive out the washer and low-pressure seal. Remove the blocks and invert the inlet manifold, placing the crankcase side up. Examine the washer for scale buildup and clean as needed. Insert the washer into the inlet manifold chamber. Examine the low-pressure seal for wear or spring fatigue and replace. Apply liquid gasket to the outer surface of the low-pressure seal and insert with the garter spring down into the manifold chamber. On the 3520, 3521, and 3527 pumps, the packings are housed in the V-packing cylinder, which is in the inlet manifold chamber and held in place with the V-packing spacer. Use a reverse pliers to remove the V-packing spacer and the V-packings from the V-packing cylinder. To service the low-pressure seal, place the inlet manifold on blocks, keeping the crankcase side down. The low-pressure seal is housed in the inlet adapter, which is then placed in the inlet manifold chamber. Using a screwdriver, tap on alternating sides of the washer to drive out the washer and the inlet adapter with low-pressure seal. Separate the washer from the inlet adapter. Then place the inlet adapter on the V